Did you know that humans are the most efficient endurance animal on the planet? Neither did Dan and Alex, but they're about to find out. Dan and Alex had been workout buddies for at least a few months now. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses, and have even broken several personal bests with one another. During their sessions, they'd have their usual banter, and on one particular day, Dan said something that would put them on an adventure. Dan began to tell Alex a story he had heard the night before on a sports documentary about this man named Gary McKee. Now, Gary was a long-distance runner and liked to run. He really liked to run. He liked running so much that one year Gary decided to run a marathon every single day. To be clear, Gary ran 26.2 miles every single day for 365 days in a row. At first, Alex had the same initial reaction as Dan did. There's no way that could happen. How can someone do that much training for that long with no recovery? However, the story was true and it happened in 2022. This got their brains turning. Do you really need to recover? Are rest days actually necessary? Are they wasting their time when they could be making gains? There was only one way to find out. Alex made the proposal, maybe not 365 days, but I bet I could train every day for 90 days. That's only 25% of what Gary did, so he thought it would be easy peasy. But Dan wasn't so sure. He already trained hard and didn't think his body could handle it. However, if he altered his training, he felt confident that he could train 90 days in a row as well. What would happen to Alex and Dan if they work out every day for 90 days? Will they make legendary gains? Will they crash and burn? Will they wish they never started? Could Alex and Dan even die? More importantly, what can we learn from this type of training? They'll find out soon enough, and you'll want to hear it. And trust us, it's not going to be what you're thinking. To understand why training 90 days straight is a bit extreme, we should first see why rest days are important. Why do we even need days off? The easy answer is because we're not machines. No matter how much your motivational poster likes to say you are, you're made up of bones that can break, muscles that tear, joints that get achy, and brains that shut down. Training can place a significantly larger amount of stress on the body. Did you know that just running can put up to 4 times your body weight of force on your joints? Weightlifting can put tremendous stress on your joints. It can also cause micro damage to your bones and strain your muscles and tendons. And both tax your neurological system, which can cause your fatigue to build up. Under normal circumstances, our bodies are equipped to deal with this damage and can fix it. That's literally what it's built to do. In fact, stressing your body and recovering from it is how training works. For a person to progress with their training, they must place a greater stimulus on their body than it's used to. When they go home and let their body recover, it will super compensate, which means it will repair the body and adapt so that it's a little bit stronger to deal with the greater stimuli in the future. The problem comes when instead of letting your body rest, you work out again. How is your body supposed to rest? When does it recover? And this is where we are with training for 90 days. What would happen? Let's see what happens with Alex. Alex started on his 90-day journey doing pretty well. He was hitting the gym every day using a body part split. He would train one muscle group every day. This seemed to be working for quite some time without any issues. Until it did. About a month in, things would start to change for Alex. Something would begin happening that would make him rethink if he really wanted to train for 90 days. That something was he started to develop symptoms of overtraining. Overtraining is when you train too much and you bring your body to a spot where it is unable to recover successfully. Therefore, rather than improve, your state worsens, and you eventually begin to see issues with your physical health, performance, and even mental health. The severity of overtraining lies on a spectrum and includes other conditions such as functional and non-functional overreaching. All of these produce the same symptoms, with the major difference being the magnitude and severity of the issues and the amount of time needed to fully recover. Regardless of where Alex was on the spectrum of overtraining at the time, it wasn't good. Even if he was at the earliest stage, once you notice you are suffering from overtraining, it's already too late. Since Alex was already experiencing these issues, the only way it would improve would be if he stopped training and rested, and it would have to be for more than just a day. As Alex was set on training every day for 90 days, his condition would not get any better during that time. Rather, it would get worse. As he continued his training, he first began to notice that his progress started to slow down. For the first few weeks, Alex was hitting all of his weights and reps just as planned. However, this stopped happening. At first he thought maybe this was just a fluke. You can't always progress. While he told himself that, he still felt something was off. Not only does he feel he should have successfully made all of his lifts, completing the entire program felt more challenging, but he continued thinking maybe he'd snap out of it. And sure enough, well, he didn't. All his trips to the gym resulted in him missing the planned weights. every day. If anything, Alex was not easily defeated and still continued. All this did was result in a bigger drop in performance until he needed to actually start taking weight off the barbell. He had to be honest with himself. He could keep going, but his goal would change. Rather than come out stronger, he now just wanted to finish. This might be a shock, as initially people may think that 90 days training will cause some massive gains. Nope! It will likely cause a loss of strength and power, especially when you train every single day. By not allowing his body to recover after training, Alex was perpetually putting his body in a state of stress. Instead of recovering, he was putting his body deeper and deeper into a hole of fatigue. So maybe he wouldn't set any more personal bests for these 90 days. Alex just changed his perspective and wanted to finish. Well, he wanted to finish, but he started waking up sore, more so than usual. After training, it's normal to experience DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness. However, this usually goes away after a couple of days, but not for Alex. Since he was not allowing his body to fully recover, he was constantly sore. His soreness even began to affect his training, as it hindered him from performing movements properly. Combined with his fatigue, his form suffered and put him at an increased risk of injury. Alex should have thrown in the towel then, yet he still continued. If anything, he sure is stubborn. Even without his pain, his training began to feel harder. Everything felt more difficult. Alex began to experience a higher RPE in his training. RPE stands for Rate of Perceived Exertion and is a subjective scale used to describe how difficult an exercise feels. Due to his buildup of fatigue, it was becoming harder for him to do the same amount of work. Think about training while fully fueled and hydrated, or in the sun while training dehydrated and not having eaten for 24 hours. Training in your starved state out in the sun is going to feel harder even if you do the same exact work. Speaking of working in a starved state, what happened next may seem counterintuitive. Alex actually started to lose his appetite and eat less. He found that he just wasn't as hungry anymore. This is something that researchers have found to occur with athletes who experience overtraining syndrome. This is a major issue, as working out for 90 days straight requires you to eat more. And eating more is exactly what Alex wasn't doing. In fact, he even seemed to drink less, leaving him constantly dehydrated. There's nothing good that happens from training in a dehydrated state, and just a 2% drop in body weight from water loss can cause a significant decrease in performance. This was yet another compounding factor that affected his performance and health, but Alex thought that he could push through it and continued. However, he started noticing changes in places he wasn't expecting. With his mental health, during his usual training, he felt that the gym was a place that relieved his stress and left him feeling confident and overall just happy. And he was right. Regular exercise will flood the body with endorphins, dopamine, and a host of other feel-good hormones. It literally gives you a natural high. This is why some are said to actually be addicted to training. Unfortunately, like other addictions, this doesn't turn out good if left unchecked. Training too much releases an unhealthy amount of cortisol and epinephrine. Cortisol is known as your stress hormone, and epinephrine is simply adrenaline. Under normal conditions, epinephrine speeds up your heart rate, which in turn pumps more blood to your muscles. Cortisol increases the ability to break down tissue for fuel such as fat and can contribute directly to increased energy and lower fatigue. However, when combined in elevated levels, these powerful compounds leave you in a permanent fight-or-flight status. This results in consistent feelings of stress and anxiety. They can also shut down the release of the feel-good hormones, which leads to mood swings and irritability. And boy, was Alex getting moody. Little things started to set him off. Not knowing where his keys were, traffic, his pre-workout spilling on the floor, everything seemed to annoy him. Alex then started to lose his motivation to train altogether. Research has shown a link between overtraining and lack of motivation due to a decrease of your mental state coupled with a drop in performance. Let's be honest, training loses all its fun if you just keep getting worse. What's interesting is this doesn't just happen to normal guys like Alex, but to professional athletes as well. You can even lose motivation when you're being offered huge amounts of money. Well, Alex wasn't getting any money, but he also didn't want to quit, so he found a way to continue. He figured he'd try to maximize his sleep, and so tried to get to bed early, limit screen time, basically do all the things you're supposed to do to improve sleep. Unfortunately, none of it helped, and even his sleep quality dropped. Researchers aren't positive as to why, but an increase in training load can lead to a decrease in the quality and quantity of sleep. This is likely due to the dysregulation in hormones. For example, researchers have discovered that when athletes increase their training by 30%, their sleep quality drops. In addition, overtraining can cause more sleep disturbances, such as heavy legs and increased movement while sleeping. So now Alex is overtrained and requires more rest, but sleeps less, which results in greater fatigue and so on. But Alex kept telling himself it would be worth it if he kept going. He would eventually benefit from all of the training. Or so he thought. However, this isn't happening. In fact, when Alex looked at himself in the mirror, he swore his muscles looked less defined and smaller. Poor sleep by itself will create an environment that promotes the breakdown of muscle while holding onto fat. Rather than improve his body composition, training every day started to do the opposite. What's the point? He thought. As if that wasn't bad enough, Alex started to get sick more often. He used to pride himself as never getting sick. Now it happens often. Working out too much causes unchecked oxidative stress, which leads to inflammation and his increased sickness. In fact, it's so common for marathon runners to get sick after races. There's a name for it, runner's flu. The outcome for Alex was looking very poor. It seems that his plan for going hard every day for 90 days was affecting just about every part of his life. But there were more areas yet to be affected. He began to feel as if his brain was always operating in a cloud of fog. He wasn't the smartest guy, but he was usually pretty sharp. But now his brain just feels slow. Understanding instructions took a tad longer, and his memory recall definitely dropped. Was he becoming dumb? No, overtraining doesn't make a person dumb. However, it can cause a drop in cognition. Overtraining in athletes has been shown to cause slower reaction times, loss of memory, and increased time to perform simple tasks. In fact, coaches even use cognitive tests to determine if their athletes are suffering from overtraining. And this is what was happening to Alex. Just like all of his other issues, the only way for his cognition to start improving was if he stopped training. And eventually Alex would be forced to stop. All of the fatigue and stress and damage built up, and Alex began to experience pain in both his knees and shoulders. He tried to push through his training, but once you have an overuse injury, rest is one of the best ways to fix it. This is the most likely outcome for athletes who try to train too hard and too often. Under normal conditions, working out has a very low risk for chance of injury. That's if you follow a professional program. If you're like Alex, your risk of injury can increase dramatically as your frequency and intensity increase. The good thing is that Alex will be able to reverse all of these ill effects, but it's going to take longer than just a weekend of binge-watching TV. His recovery time is going to depend on the extent of his damage, but he can expect to take at least one full week off to recover. There are some cases where trainees have had to take months off. What a shame it would be if you trained and pushed through 90 days of hard training, only to finish beaten up, broken down, depressed, and in a worse physical condition than when you started. At the beginning of the video, we told you that you would learn 2 lessons. The first is what not to do, and the second is perhaps the most important lesson you need to learn to maintain a healthy lifestyle. Now, Alex obviously showed us what not to do. If you train for 90 days with no plan, you will experience negative consequences in just about every aspect of your life and likely get injured. But we now have Dan's journey. He's going to teach you that important lesson, but he won't realize it until 90 days have passed. Let's now see what happens when Dan trains for 90 days. Unlike Alex, Dan was not going to hit the gym hard for 90 days as he was, in fact, not Superman. He was just a mere mortal who loved fitness. Instead of going to the gym every day, he was going to use a style of training known as cross-training. What is cross-training? Cross-training refers to the practice of engaging in different modes of sport or training simultaneously. Primary training was still going to be weightlifting. However, he would use 3 other styles of exercise: running, swimming, and cycling. He felt that this would be the key to his success. One issue Dan had with how Alex trained was he felt going to the gym every day for 90 days may become stale. Dan loves lifting weights, however, he felt by using cross-training, every day would be a fresh and a new challenge. This would make his whole 90 days much easier to do. So Dan followed his program. And like Alex, his first few weeks were relatively easy. He expected this and knew it would take a few days to see how his body was responding. But as weeks went by, Dan found he wasn't really experiencing the excessive amounts of soreness, achiness, or even fatigue. Of course, it was challenging, but his cross-training allowed him to apply stimuli to different parts of his body. This mitigated the buildup of stress and fatigue. In the long term, this would greatly reduce the risk of overuse injuries, so he doesn't wind up like Alex. Using cross-training, Dan was able to spread the soreness around, or should we say spread the love around. Of course, there were days where he had higher levels, but nothing that he would describe as out of the ordinary. Now Alex thought he would be able to do this by training different muscle groups on different days. However, even when training different muscle groups, it still puts a load on the same joints. For example, the elbows get hit on back day, chest day, shoulder day, arms. Heck, even back squats put stress on the elbows. On the contrary, Dan was able to plan his schedule so that he used different sports on different days to train different muscles and movement patterns. Running would be hard on Dan's knees, so the next day he could do an upper body session in the gym. The next day he could cycle and then swim. Dan also used these different sports to train with different intensity. When you only go to the gym to lift weights, there's rarely such a thing as low intensity. However, he is able to do this with the endurance-type sports. For example, one day he had a really tough leg day. He was supposed to run uphill sprints the next day, but that sounded brutal. Therefore, he altered his plan and performed a 1.5-hour bike ride at a low intensity. This allowed him to still train, but in a manner that was easier on his body. After that long ride, he noticed something very important. He was hungry. One thing that made it hard was needing to miss out on some events to train. Perhaps he'd need to go home early because he needed to get up early, or maybe missing out on a trip to the beach. Of course, he could have gone, but that would have been cheating. He just chalked it up to being another part of the challenge. He just needed to complete these 90 days, and he continued on. Since Dan was keeping his training in check, he didn't notice the same lack of appetite that Alex did. This made it easy to stay on top of his nutrition and mitigate any possible issues that may arise. With a full belly, Dan continued on with his challenge and began to function like clockwork. He was even getting full nights of sleep as he made it a priority. This was the only time his body could recover, so he wanted to make the most of it. Dan continued his routine, never doing more than his plan had planned. One thing he noticed about working out 90 days is that time goes by fast. Soon enough, his 90 days were up, and he had successfully trained every single day. When he was done, he looked great. Dan wasn't trying to lose weight and was making a point to eat enough. However, his body composition had still improved. It's hard not to improve when you're training every day. Further, his work capacity had significantly improved. Training 90 days increased the amount of work that he could handle. Increased work volume equals increased gains. However, Dan's greatest benefit wasn't necessarily his physical adaptations or improvements in performance. Rather, he had built a resilient body and a resilient mind. During his 90 days, he learned a very important lesson: the difference between motivation and dedication. While his routine may have seemed easier than Alex's, it was still tough. Some days he simply wanted to take the day off, not because of soreness or any fatigue, but he just didn't want to. Remember earlier in the video when we spoke about even professional athletes losing motivation? A little caveat we left out is they still trained as planned. Oftentimes, this is the key difference between being successful or not. This was one variable neither of them had even thought about. They were so caught up in the challenge, they didn't even consider having the motivation to train for 90 days. Of course, Alex had issues with fatigue and soreness, but they both had to deal with training when they didn't want to. Sometimes you're not going to be motivated to train, but you still must get out and do it. And this was the main lesson Dan learned during his 90 days of training: the difference between motivation and dedication. Everyone usually talks about being motivated, but the truth is you won't always be motivated to train. Actually, training is easy when you're motivated. What's hard is maintaining consistency when you're not motivated. This is dedication, and dedication is the only way you will be successful.